The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, a heavy silence settling in its wake. Judge Harold Lancaster, a man whose reputation for harsh, biased rulings was well known, leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the papers before him with barely disguised indifference. He had seen cases like this before, too many times to count, and he already knew how this one would end. The whispers in the courtroom were barely audible, murmurs of quiet judgment and resigned acceptance. No one expected fairness. No one expected justice. Marcus Johnson stood at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders squared, but his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a troublemaker. He was a mechanic, a man who worked with his hands, who had spent years earning every dollar with sweat and grit. But standing here in front of this judge, none of that mattered. He could feel the weight of unseen forces pressing down on him, the unspoken truth that justice was rarely blind when it came to men who looked like him. His dark eyes remained steady as the judge finally acknowledged him, his voice flat, devoid of interest. Marcus Johnson, charged with operating a vehicle with a defective brake light. How do you plead? The words were routine, but Marcus felt the inevitability behind them. He had been pulled over just the night before on his way home from work, the officer not caring to hear that he was heading to the repair shop the next morning. He had tried to explain, but explanations had no value in situations like these. Now, standing in this courtroom, facing a man who held his fate in his hands, he swallowed down the frustration clawing at his throat. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said, his voice even, controlled. "I was on my way to get the lights fixed when I was pulled over. I have the receipt from the shop." He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the crumpled slip of paper that proved his intentions. But before he could present it, the judge lifted a dismissive hand, barely looking up from his desk. "That won't be necessary," the judge said, cutting him off before he could continue. A ripple of quiet unease ran through the small audience. Marcus's mother, Evelyn, sat near the back, gripping her worn leather purse tightly, her knuckles pale. She had been here before, had seen this play out too many times. She had prayed this morning, like she always did, for mercy, for fairness, for something other than the crushing inevitability that had loomed over their lives since the day Marcus was old enough to understand the rules weren't the same for everyone. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "Your Honor, I've heard enough," the judge interrupted again, barely sparing Marcus a glance. $1,500 fine, payable immediately." Silence. The words fell like a hammer, heavier than the gavel in his hand. Marcus felt his breath still in his chest. A $1,500 fine? For a broken brake light? His mother let out a soft, barely audible gasp. She knew, just as he did, that they didn't have that kind of money. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not any time soon. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. He turned to his court-appointed attorney, James Holloway, a middle-aged man who looked more bored than invested. Marcus's stomach twisted as he realized the man hadn't even reacted. "Aren't you going to say something?" Marcus asked, his voice low, controlled. Holloway exhaled through his nose, finally looking up from his notes. He shrugged. "It's a traffic fine, Marcus. Just pay it and move on." Move on. Marcus swallowed hard. Move on to what? To struggling even more, to scraping together money that didn't exist, to choosing between rent and groceries? He had been here before, had seen others fall beneath the weight of fines that were never meant to be fair. But this time, it was different. This time, he was tired. "I don't have that kind of money," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of suppressed anger. The judge barely reacted, didn't even look at him. "Then you'll serve the alternative. 30 days in county lockup." The words came cold, detached, as if they meant nothing. A decision made before Marcus had even stepped foot in this room. A strangled noise escaped his mother's lips, barely above a whisper, but to Marcus it was louder than anything else in the room. He turned to her, saw the desperation in her eyes, the heartbreak, the helplessness of a mother watching her son be swallowed by a system designed to break him. His shoulders dropped slightly, the crushing weight of inevitability pressing down harder. What was the point of fighting when the game was rigged? The gavel was raised again, ready to bring this all to an end. And then, just before it could fall, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. The sudden movement sent a sharp gasp rippling through the audience as heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the stagnant air. A woman stepped forward, her presence alone commanding attention. Confident, unshaken, eyes sharp with purpose, she moved with a certainty that sent a hush over the room. "Not so fast, Your Honor," her voice rang out, steady, unwavering. The judge stiffened, barely masking his irritation as all eyes turned to the source of the disruption. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, brows furrowed, uncertain of what was happening. Marcus turned, his own confusion mirrored in the faces of those around him. The woman stood tall, her expression unreadable, her tailored suit crisp, her dark brown eyes locked onto the judge without an ounce of hesitation. The name carried weight in this town, weight that certain people had hoped would never be felt in their courtroom. Attorney Gabrielle Carter, a force the judge hadn't anticipated, a force he wasn't ready for. "My client has the right to a fair defense," she continued, stepping forward without breaking eye contact. "And I intend to give him one." A muscle ticked in the judge's jaw. He exhaled sharply through his nose, the first flicker of genuine irritation crossing his face. The power in the room had shifted, and he knew it. Marcus felt the shift too, a small spark igniting in his chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since stepping foot in this courtroom. Hope. His mother pressed a trembling hand to her chest, the breath she had been holding finally escaping, the weight, the despair, the helplessness that had hung in the air only moments ago had begun to lift. For the first time, Marcus wasn't standing alone. The heavy doors swung open, and the murmurs in the courtroom died instantly. Heels clicked against the polished floor, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. Gabrielle Carter strode forward, her presence commanding, a force unseen in this courtroom before. The weight of 100 silent stares pressed against her, but she remained unfazed. Eyes locked on the judge, she carried herself with the certainty of a woman who knew what she was here to do. The room stiffened. The audience, a mixture of curiosity and unease, shifted in their seats. A black woman taking the lead in a courtroom like this was unheard of. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tapping against the wooden bench, betraying the irritation he tried to conceal. A challenge. He didn't like challenges. He didn't like being questioned. Gabrielle, unwavering, met his gaze head on. She stepped up beside Marcus, her presence steady and deliberate. Marcus, who had stood alone against a system determined to break him, now had someone standing beside him. Her voice, crisp and unwavering, sliced through the tense air. "Your Honor, I'm requesting a retrial." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, his fingers stilling against the bench. "A retrial for this man? On what grounds?" His tone carried the weight of disbelief and growing impatience. Gabrielle didn't hesitate. "On the grounds that my client wasn't given a fair chance to defend himself." A scoff, a slight shake of his head. "You're wasting the court's time, Miss Carter." He waved a hand, already preparing to move on. "The ruling has been made." Gabrielle remained firm. "I have legal grounds to contest this decision." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the charged silence thickening. The courtroom, once resigned to the inevitable outcome, now hummed with the quiet energy of something different. A battle had begun. She took a breath and laid out the numbers with precision. Black men in this courtroom are fined 3 times higher than white defendants for the same violations. Similar cases, wildly different punishments. The pattern is undeniable. The judge's face darkened, his controlled facade beginning to crack. His voice was slow, deliberate, laced with a warning. "Are you accusing this court of racism?" Gabrielle held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm presenting the facts." The prosecutor, seated beside the judge, leaned forward, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Statistics don't prove intent," he interjected, his voice raised. "She's twisting the numbers." Gabrielle turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I'm showing documented disparities. If the court wants to refute them, it can do so with evidence of its own." A flicker of something crossed the prosecutor's face, but he masked it quickly. "This is standard procedure." Gabrielle tilted her head slightly. "Then perhaps it's time we question standard procedure." Marcus sat still, watching, his chest rising and falling steadily. His mother, clutching her purse, stole a glance at him. For the first time in the long, suffocating hours of this case, he felt something shift. He wasn't standing alone anymore. The weight of years of injustice pressed against this moment. Gabrielle refused to let it crush her. The tension in the courtroom thickened like a heavy fog, pressing against every wall, every seat, every breath. Judge Harold Lancaster shifted in his chair, his grip on the gavel tightening. His patience, already stretched thin, finally snapped. His voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and unfiltered. "Men like him are always up to something." The words hung in the air like a slap. A slow, stunned silence spread across the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief flashing across faces that had seen too much to be truly surprised. Marcus's mother inhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling with a mix of fury and heartbreak. Her hands trembled against the fabric of her dress, the weight of years of silent prayers crashing down in an instant. A rustling of papers, a frantic scribbling of pens. Reporters in the back row jotted down notes furiously, sensing the moment that would define the trial, perhaps even the judge's career. Eyes darted from Marcus to Gabrielle, then back to the judge. The room, once thick with resignation, now crackled with something else. Gabrielle Carter did not blink. Her heels clicked once against the floor as she stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the judge with a piercing certainty. "Did you just say that?" Her voice, steady as stone, carried through the courtroom. Judge Lancaster's jaw tightened. His mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. The weight of his own words was pressing against him now. "You heard me," Gabrielle continued, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Would you like to repeat yourself for the record?" A hush fell over the room, followed by a slow, building murmur. Someone shifted in their seat. A few heads turned toward the back, where reporters leaned forward, ears straining, pens poised. The judge cleared his throat, but the crack in his authority had already formed. He glanced toward the prosecutor's table, as if searching for an out, but there was none. Gabrielle wasn't done. "Your Honor, by your own words, you have demonstrated clear bias." She turned to the audience, letting the weight of the moment settle. "This is not an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern." She moved to the defense table and retrieved a stack of documents, holding them up. "These are case files, dozens of them, all with one thing in common. Black men fined at rates significantly higher than their white counterparts for the same minor offenses." She let the words settle, then turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, your rulings show a clear, deliberate pattern of discrimination." Judge Lancaster's face darkened. "Ms. Carter, you are dangerously close to contempt." "No, Your Honor," Gabrielle shot back, her voice never wavering. "What's dangerous is a system that allows this to continue unchecked." A voice cleared at the prosecutor's table. The prosecutor, who had been silently observing, finally shifted in his chair, his confidence visibly shaken. "We should perhaps reconsider." His words were low, hesitant. His gaze flickered toward the reporters, then back to the judge, as if weighing the consequences of staying aligned with a sinking ship. The judge glared at him, but it was clear. The courtroom had shifted. The fear of speaking out was gone. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. People were no longer whispering. They were talking, questioning. Gabrielle took a step forward, voice unwavering. "Every case you've ruled unfairly will be re-examined." The judge clenched his teeth, but the tide had already turned. "And if this ruling isn't overturned," Gabrielle pressed on, her words slow, deliberate, "we will take this to the state court." The crowd buzzed with energy. The judge's face reddened. a mix of rage and something else, something Gabrielle had never seen in him before: fear. "And when we do," she continued, never breaking eye contact, "this entire courthouse will be under investigation." The gavel in his hand trembled slightly. He exhaled, but the breath came out uneven. His choices were dwindling. His power, once absolute in this room, was slipping from his grasp. The weight of years of unchecked rulings, of lives altered at his hand, now it was pressing back on him. For the first time in his career, Judge Harold Lancaster looked afraid. The judge's face had lost its color, his authority crumbling beneath the weight of the truth now laid bare for all to see. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation, every person in attendance holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Judge Harold Lancaster, once the most unshakable force in this room, sat frozen in his chair. For the first time, he wasn't in control. His fingers twitched around the gavel, the very symbol of his power now feeling unfamiliar in his grasp. His eyes darted across the room, at the reporters, the murmuring spectators, the prosecutor who had already started to distance himself. There was no saving this. He exhaled sharply, his lips tightening into a thin line as he forced the words from his mouth, his voice barely above a growl. "Charges dismissed." A pause. A moment of stillness where no one moved, no one even breathed. Then, like the shattering of a dam, the courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief, relief. A town where justice had always tilted one way had just seen the impossible. Marcus's legs felt weak, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. He turned to Gabrielle, searching for some kind of confirmation that this was real, that after everything, he was finally free. Before he could speak, a familiar set of arms wrapped around him, his mother, Evelyn, clutching him with all the strength she had left. Her body trembled against his, her shoulders shaking as years of silent prayers, of fear, of helplessness, all came pouring out in gasping sobs. "My boy," she whispered, her hands cradling the back of his head like she had when he was a child. "My baby." Marcus's own breath hitched. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of her embrace ground him. His mother had always carried her pain quietly, had always swallowed her fear and carried on. But now she wept freely, tears of joy, tears of exhaustion, tears of a mother who had lived too long with the fear of losing her son to a system never meant to protect him. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Some whispered in awe, others in anger, questioning how many more had suffered before this moment. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as microphones were thrust forward. How many other cases should be re-examined? What does this mean for the judge's past rulings? How did this injustice go unchecked for so long? The questions swirled, and for the first time in decades, the walls of this courtroom weren't closing in on the accused. They were closing in on the man who had sat at its highest seat. The whispers of investigation turned into open discussion. Names were spoken aloud. Men who had once sat in Marcus's place. Men who hadn't been lucky enough to have someone like Gabrielle Carter fighting for a free temporality. Judge Lancaster remained stiff, his face unreadable, but the cracks in his authority had turned to deep fractures. He had ruled this town's justice system unchecked for years, but now it was his record under scrutiny. His rulings, his sentencing history, his biases, all of it was being dragged into the light. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with something Marcus hadn't felt in years: hope. He stepped out, the sun hitting his face, the voices of the press still ringing in the distance. Gabrielle stood beside him, her expression unreadable, though her eyes carried something softer now, something tired yet unwavering. Marcus turned to her, his voice steady for the first time in a long time. "You didn't just fight for me," he said, his words carrying more weight than he realized. "You fought for everyone." Gabrielle nodded, her lips curling into something almost like a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "One case at a time," she murmured. She knew the battle was far from over. This was one man, one case, one moment of justice in a sea of countless others who had never had their chance to fight back. The war wasn't won. Not yet. One man was free, but how many more were still trapped? How many names remained buried in files, lost to a system built to keep them there? This wasn't a happy ever after. This was a warning. Because true justice wasn't a single moment. It was a fight that never stopped.